What if I told you that the bright red slice sitting on your burger, the one you might casually swipe off with your fork or squeezy into a ketchup puddle, carries a story that stretches back millions of years, crosses oceans, reshaped entire cuisines, and reshuffled the way the world eats? What if that red fruit, that we call a vegetable every day, was once a tiny wild berry clinging to rocky cliffs in South America unknown to Europe, Asia, Africa, and only given its destiny by indigenous farmers long before Columbus ever set foot in the Caribbean? That is not hyperbole. That is documented history. The tomato did not start as pizza sauce. It did not start as ketchup. It was not born red. And it wasn't always a staple of the foods we assume are timeless. Instead, it began as part of ancient ecosystems, was shaped by human hands. Long before modern agriculture existed, was misunderstood and mistrusted in parts of the world, and ultimately became one of the most transformative plants in global culinary history. And today, we are going to take that journey, step by step, from ancestral landscapes to modern plates, from wild genetics to industrial farms, from culinary confusion to global domination. This is classic food history, detailed, step by step, myth-free, and rooted in real cultural, agricultural, and botanical evidence. But before we rewind all the way back, let me say something real. If you love deep food history, real research, and stories that actually change how you see what's on your plate, subscribe now. Hit that button and stick with me through this deep dive, because once you understand where something as simple as a tomato came from, you'll never look at food the same way again. Now, let's rewind way back, long before humans cultivated tomatoes, long before farms, cities, or writing, far before European kingdoms ever dreamed of the Americas. In the high, rugged landscapes of the Andes Mountains, in what is now Peru, Ecuador, northern Chile, and parts of Bolivia, the ancestors of the tomato were growing wild among an astonishing variety of plant life. The Andes are one of the most biologically diverse places on Earth. Unlike large flat plains where climates stay similar for hundreds of miles, the Andes can change dramatically. Over just a few thousand feet of elevation, you go from foggy coastal deserts to high alpine tundra to fertile valleys in a matter of hours. This creates isolated microclimates, pockets of land where plants evolve at different rates, responding to very specific environmental pressures. Some of these wild plants belong to the Solanaceae family, the nightshades. This family includes potatoes, eggplants, peppers, and tomatoes, but it also includes toxic plants like belladonna. The nightshade family has a reputation for both food and poison, and that duality would later show up in how different cultures perceive the tomato. The plant we know as the modern tomato goes by its scientific name Solanum lycopersicum. Botanically speaking, it is a fruit, specifically a berry, because it develops from a single ovary of a flower. But in kitchens around the world, it is treated as a vegetable. That distinction matters less when you're making sauce, but it matters more when we talk about how the tomato evolved and how humans classified it over time. The earliest tomato ancestors were tiny. Some stood no larger than currants, rather than the plump, juicy, bright red fruits you buy at a supermarket. These wild berries were small, often yellowish or green, and their flavor ranged from sweet to sharp, to downright unremarkable. They were not uniform. They were not domesticated. They were wild, plants shaped by birds, animals, wind, gravity, and nothing more. One of the closest living wild relatives to those ancestral tomatoes still exists today, Solanum pimpinellifolium, commonly known as the currant tomato. It grows naturally in parts of coastal Peru and Ecuador. Genetic studies show that this plant is one of the closest matches to the early forms of the tomato before people began to change it. Modern breeders still look to it for genetic diversity, especially for traits like disease resistance. But here's where the story shifts from wild biology to human history. While the tomato's origins lie in the Andes, it was not fully domesticated there. Instead, archaeological and genetic evidence points to Mesoamerica, specifically central Mexico, as the place where the wild tomato was first shaped into something intentional, edible, and recognizable. Humans didn't discover the tomato in a single moment. There is no single date etched in stone, but by around 500 BCE, people in central Mexico were intentionally cultivating tomatoes. They weren't merely gathering them from the wild, they were selecting seeds, planting preferred traits, and nurturing these plants across seasons. This is the beginning of true domestication. Domestication isn't an event. It is a process, a slow accumulation of human choices repeated across generations, decisions about size, taste, texture, plant vigor, Early farmers selected plants that produced larger fruit, less bitterness, more flesh, better texture. They saved seeds from the plants that met their standards and planted them again. Over centuries, this iterative process reshaped the wild tomato into something new. And this did not happen in isolation. The people of Mesoamerica were already expert agriculturalists. They had transformed wild teosinte, a grass with tiny kernels, into maize, which became one of the most important staple crops in human history. They cultivated beans, squash, chili peppers, amaranth, and a wide range of other plants long before Europeans ever crossed the Atlantic. Their agricultural knowledge was deep, systematic, and highly sophisticated, and the tomato was part of that system. The very word tomato carries a linguistic clue to its origin. In Nahuatl, the language spoken by the Aztecs and other central Mexican cultures, the word for the fruit was tomato. Spanish explorers later adopted that word as tomata, which eventually became tomato in English. So every time you say the word tomato, you are echoing a term that originated in Mesoamerica long before it ever showed up in Europe. By the early 1500s, when Spanish conquistadors entered central Mexico, tomatoes were already an established part of local food culture. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, located where Mexico City stands today, was one of the largest cities in the world at that time. European chroniclers who visited described its massive marketplaces filled with produce, sauces, spices, and prepared foods. Tomatoes were sold and eaten alongside chilies, beans, squash, maize, cacao, and dozens of other crops. Tomatoes were more than a curiosity. They were normal food. That matters, because too many popular narratives about the tomato start with European bewilderment. Tales of people refusing to eat it because they thought it was poisonous. We'll get to that part. But it's crucial to understand that in Mesoamerica, long before Europe had any concept of the plant, it was already food, cooked, selected, and integrated into daily meals. Now let's shift continents. After the conquest of the Aztec Empire, Spanish control over trade routes allowed plants and crops from the New World to move back across the Atlantic. This movement was part of what historians call the Columbian Exchange, the massive transfer of plants, animals, microbes, and people between the Americas and the Old World that reshaped global ecosystems forever. Tomatoes were among the crops transported to Europe in the early 16th century. By the 1520s and 1530s, they were being grown in Spain. From there, cultivation spread into southern Italy and other parts of the Mediterranean where the climate was suitable. One of the earliest detailed European descriptions appears in 1544 in a botanical work by the Italian physician Pietro Andrea Mattioli. He described a plant brought from the Americas that bore segmented fruit turning golden when ripe. But despite this early description, confusion and caution surrounded the tomato in Europe. Botanical classification at the time placed it in the nightshade family, the same family as toxic plants, like belladonna, and because of that association, some Europeans were initially wary of eating it. A common myth holds that Europeans universally believed tomatoes were poisonous and avoided them for centuries. The reality is more nuanced. Yes, membership in the nightshade family raised suspicion. Yes, some early adopters treated tomatoes as ornamental plants. And yes, there were reports of poisoning, but many of those cases were actually caused by lead poisoning from acidic tomato juice reacting with pewter plates worn by wealthy households. Pewter, an alloy containing lead, was common among elites in parts of Europe. When acidic foods like tomatoes touched it, lead leached into the food. Wealthy diners got sick, and the tomato got blamed. But that doesn't mean all of Europe recoiled from the fruit. In Spain and parts of Italy, tomatoes were being eaten and cooked within decades of their rival. In Italy, early tomatoes were often yellow rather than red. That's why one of the Italian names for the plant was pomodoro, meaning golden apple. In France, the term pomme d'amour, love apple, appeared, though historians debate whether the name reflected supposed aphrodisiac properties or simply poetic naming conventions. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, tomatoes began showing up in southern European recipes. They were stewed, roasted, and combined with herbs and olive oil. They weren't yet ubiquitous, and they certainly weren't the base of classic tomato sauces the way we know them today, but their presence was growing. Here's a fact that surprises many people. Ancient Rome had no tomatoes, none, no red pasta sauce, no pizza with tomato topping. The Roman Empire collapsed more than 1,000 years before tomatoes ever crossed the Atlantic. So when people describe tomato-based dishes as ancient Italian tradition, that's historically inaccurate. Italian tomato traditions developed after the 16th century, and the strongest documentation of tomato sauces appears in Italy in the 17th and 18th centuries. By the 18th century, especially around Naples and southern Italy, tomatoes had become more thoroughly integrated into cuisine. Street vendors sold flatbreads topped with local ingredients, and eventually, tomatoes became toppings. The pizza we know today, with tomato, mozzarella, and basil, took shape in the 19th century in Naples, centuries after the tomato's rival in Europe. While tomatoes were gaining ground in Europe, they were also spreading globally through colonial trade networks. Portuguese merchants introduced tomatoes to parts of West Africa and to the Indian subcontinent. Over time, local cuisines incorporated tomatoes in region-specific ways. In India, tomatoes blended with spices to become part of gravies and chutneys. In West Africa, they became central to stews and sauces. In the Ottoman Empire, tomatoes found their way into salads and cooked dishes. Adoption was neither uniform nor instantaneous. Climate, taste preferences, agricultural feasibility, and trade access all influenced how and when tomatoes became part of local food traditions. But by the 19th century, tomatoes were present across multiple continents. Back in North America, the tomato story took another twist. Although the plant was native to the Americas, British colonists in the 17th and 18th centuries often regarded it as an ornamental oddity, not a food staple. Many early North American gardens grew tomatoes for curiosity, not cuisine. But attitudes shifted over time. By the early 19th century, tomatoes were increasingly cultivated for consumption. Seed catalogs in the United States began listing multiple tomato varieties by the mid-1800s, reflecting growing demand and agricultural experimentation. One of the most consequential developments in tomato history was industrial processing. In the late 19th century, advances in canning technology made it possible to preserve tomatoes without immediate spoilage. Before this, tomatoes were highly seasonal, enjoyed fresh only when in season and in the vicinity of where they were grown. Canning changed that. Suddenly, tomatoes could be transported across long distances, stored for months, and incorporated into industrial food supply chains. This era also saw a dramatic transformation in tomato products. Early versions of ketchup were not tomato-based at all. The word ketchup likely comes from a Southeast Asian fish sauce called K-siap. British traders encountered that sauce and brought back recipes that were mushroom or walnut-based. Tomato ketchup emerged in the United States during the 19th century and became a commercial product standardized by companies such as H.J. Heinz in the late 1800s. The tomato was no longer just produce, it became processed food. It became synonymous with industrial food culture. As the 20th century unfolded, tomato breeding accelerated. Farmers and agricultural scientists selected for traits that mattered in commercial markets: uniform ripening, thicker skins for transport durability, disease resistance, higher yields, and long shelf life. This focus increased global production, but often came at the expense of flavor. Heirloom varieties, diverse, flavorful, genetically rich strains, persisted in smaller markets, cherished by growers and chefs, while large commercial operations favored standardized, transport-friendly cultivars. Today, the tomato is one of the most widely cultivated crops in the world. Global production exceeds well over 180 million metric tons annually. Countries like China, India, the United States, Turkey, and Egypt rank among the top producers. Tomatoes are consumed fresh, canned, juiced, dried, pureed, fermented, and powdered. They are embedded so deeply in global cuisines that many people assume they have always been there. But that's the remarkable thing. In historical terms, the tomato's global journey is incredibly fast. Within roughly 5 centuries of its rival in Europe, it reshaped Mediterranean cuisine, influenced American fast food culture, became essential to South Asian gravies, and found its way into African stews. And at the foundation of that transformation lies indigenous agricultural knowledge. Without any biodiversity, there would be no genetic base for tomatoes. Without thousands of years of selective cultivation by Mesoamerican farmers, there would be no domesticated tomato to spread. Without the Columbian Exchange, there would be no global tomato cuisine. When you look at a tomato today, whether on your burger, in your pasta sauce, or squeezed out as ketchup, you are looking at a biological migrant shaped by geography, culture, empire, science, and economics. You are looking at millions of years of evolution layered with thousands of years of human choice and centuries of global exchange. The tomato proves that what we think of as traditional cuisine is often the result of movement, adaptation, and reinvention. Tradition is not static. It absorbs new elements. It adapts to new climates and new cultures. And it evolves. So next time someone tells you pizza is ancient Italian heritage unchanged since Caesar's day, remember, the tomato only arrived in Italy in the 1500s. The red sauce, the ketchup, the marinara, those are all products of centuries of travel, transformation, and human ingenuity. And that's not just food history. That's global history. History that literally ended up on your plate. Thanks for watching. If this deep dive changed how you see something as simple as a tomato, imagine what else in your pantry has a story like this. If you want more deep, myth-free, research-based food history, with real context and real stories, hit subscribe, ring that bell, and stay tuned, because every ingredient has a past, and once you understand that past, you'll never look at food the same way again.